If you've been following the stories of carbon capture, carbon utilization, and the future scenarios, global warming targets, and so on, you know that we rely heavily on negative emission technologies and carbon removal, it's called carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon capture utilization and sequestration, and so on. So there are issues of just scalability. Lots of concepts and implementations of CO2 removal already exist. Iceland is big on this, and many other countries want to try it, but the scale at which they remove directly CO2 from the air is tiny. And then there are issues of socio-technical transitions of how CCS and CCUS will play into economies, NDCs, nationally determined contributions, global mitigation plans, and so on. But this is an interesting Policy Forum article from Science that appeared last year in 2023 that talks about legal limits to the use of CO2 removal. I'm including this just because it's an angle that somebody like me, a climate scientist, would never think of. So this is about climate targets that depend heavily on CO2 removal may contravene international law. So there are many laws. Apparently we won't be reading all of them. These are the authors here. These people write some interesting papers all the time on socio-technical and legal issues of various climate mitigation policies, plans, goals, and so on. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, has indicated that to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees C consistent with the goals of the 2015 Paris Agreement, global carbon dioxide emissions need to be reduced to net zero by around mid-century. Many people already think 1.5 degrees C is going to be exceeded very quickly and very definitely. This global goal can be achieved by following various technologically feasible emissions pathways, but the range of possible strategies create legal and policy uncertainty regarding the emissions reductions required by the states. I have lots of podcasts on IPCC, AR6, even AR5 on my channel that you can look up. Pathways differ in their rates of gross and net CO2 emission reductions, their corresponding dependence on CO2 removal to stay within the cumulative emissions limit imposed by the global temperature goal, and the type of CDR they intend to deploy. So what is the cumulative carbon comment here? Basically we know that CO2 doesn't disappear quickly. It has residence time of multiple centuries. So it's been accumulating since the Industrial Revolution, where we started to ramp up fossil fuel burning, and now it's clear that the warming is almost linearly proportional to cumulative carbon. So if you have a temperature target, then it lets you back out how much more carbon you can emit to stay within that. That's what is called usually carbon budget, or cumulative CO2 reference comes from there. But of course you have to remember there are other greenhouse gases, so it's tricky anyways, plus lots of uncertainties in the carbon cycle, sources and sinks, and so you have to be careful if somebody says we have only so many years left to save ourselves, and so on and so forth. So in the lead up to this year's United Nations Climate Conference of the Parties 28 in Dubai, we present scientific and legal basis for our argument that emission reduction pathways that depend heavily on CDR may contravene norms and principles of international law. Cumulatively, countries' policies are incompatible with the Paris Agreement temperature goal and will result in permanently exceeding 2 degrees C of warming unless vast quantities of CO2 are removed from the atmosphere. So this is from the science side. I'm just taking bits and pieces of the text and not reading the whole thing. However, individual states' dependence on CDR to meet climate targets and the consistency of that dependence with applicable international legal norms and principles is currently unknown and unaddressed in the literature. Consequently, lawyers and policy advocates lack the tools to hold states accountable for excessive CDR reliance because of inadequate near-term emissions cuts. This has posed challenges in judicial evaluation of states' mitigation policy. In other words, if you don't do a quick drawdown now, you're going to depend more and more on CDR into the future. So you have to reduce emissions, renewables, EVs, all the good things. But if you keep delaying these actions and want to meet your targets by heavily drawing down CO2, then it has different legal consequences or implications. For example, in Agenda Foundation versus State of the Netherlands, the Hague Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court of the Netherlands relied on older emission pathways premised on lower CDR use to minimize risk. Although understandable in the context, relying on outdated modeling is legally suboptimal. We identify illustrative norms and principles of international law that offer a framework for assessing the legality of emissions pathways. I'm just reading it, so you have to just understand that beyond all the social acceptance, socio-technical transitions, technical feasibilities of CDR, carbon dioxide removal, there are legal implications. So the legal implications of CDR dependence to meet climate goals then: emission reduction pathways that depend heavily on CDR with all these incumbent risks may conflict with norms and principles of international law spanning treaty and custom. The Paris Agreement sets a direction of travel by identifying a long-term temperature goal and imposing binding obligations on parties to submit every 5 years nationally determined contributions in line with the global temperature goal, each reflecting a progression on the previous NDC. Parties are encouraged to explain how their NDCs are fair, ambitious, and associated. COP decisions that provide interpretive context create a normative pull, a legal direction of travel toward aligning short-term NDCs with long-term strategies and encouraging states to lay out pathways to the global temperature goal that are rooted in scientific evidence. That's a long sentence, but nonetheless, you understand, right? There is all these agreements, commitments, goals that are not scientific, as I've discussed elsewhere. 2 degrees C, 1.5 degrees C are made up, and then we have retrofitted climate impacts at those targets, and then when they exceed, we need to understand what that means. How long can you exceed them without creating new problems, or does it matter how long you cross? Do things happen immediately? Lots of headlines will come as you cross 1.5. Almost happened in 2023-24 because of the record warming, combination of global warming and a volcano and an El Nino and so on and so forth. So all these things are complicated, right? Emission reduction pathways that depend heavily on CDR, given their corresponding risks and uncertainties, go against the grain of these provisions. Justice, equality, and so on are not always considered when you have a tunnel vision on global warming targets and mitigation required to achieve those. Heavily CDR reliant pathways are also incompatible with the human rights approach to achieving climate goals. Indeed, the impacts of climate change on human rights are subject to growing litigation in national and regional courts. There are some examples given that I'm going to skip and jump ahead. Even if the preambular reference to human rights in the Paris Agreement, which is preambular recital number 11, even if it does not render it a human rights treaty, it signals that states need to consider how climate change threatens their ability to meet their obligations under multilateral human rights treaties. So you commit to something and you try hard to stick to those to reduce risks, but who's paying a price, or whose risk and vulnerability or exposure are going up, and so on. Most states have obligations in relations to rights to life, privacy and home life, culture and health, among others, under a range of human rights instruments, as have other UN bodies. The UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights noted that failure to prevent foreseeable human rights harm caused by climate change could constitute a breach of states' obligations to respect, protect and fulfill all human rights for all people, harms that may be increased by following higher overshoot pathways. So you have climate change happening already. Many developing countries are paying a price in terms of impacts, and then you are coming along and saying we are going to mitigate our impact on climate change, which is again led by, let's say, rich countries. Poor countries are committed to NDCs, Paris Agreement, which they have to do things about, which includes interventions in their people's lives, livelihoods, and maybe even moving people eventually and so on. So where do all these things meet in terms of people's rights, vulnerabilities, exposure to risks and so on? So CDR risks and climate outcomes. A given net emissions pathway and climate outcome can result from gross emissions of different levels balanced by corresponding dependence on different levels of CO2 removal, or CDR. For a given climate outcome, greater dependence on CDR to balance larger gross emissions entails additional risks, as we'll see in a minute. Delayed reductions in net emissions create increased reliance on CDR to remove excess emissions produced in peak and decline pathways, resulting in increased climate change impacts during and for many impacts after the temperature overshoot period, which we will see in the next panel. So essentially you are saying we are going to delay emissions reductions and then allow overshoot of 1.5 and 2 degrees C targets and bring them back by increasing reliance on CDR, assuming this all works. How long will you overshoot, and what the impacts will be, and whether the impacts really disappear even if you brought the overshoot back and went under 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C? Obviously not, but still. So scenario approaches here, gross CO2 emission, gross CO2 removal. So they depend on various scenarios. So scenario outcomes 1 and 2 in orange, scenario 3 in bluish, greenish, whatever that color is, net CO2 and temperature. So you are looking at all these things together. And scenario approach here again, gross CO2 emissions and what we just saw. So same climate outcomes, different risks. So you have scenario 1 and 2 where you are following net CO2 here and bringing it into zero somewhere in the 2040s, and so CO2 emissions are having these pathways in 1 and 2. This is CO2 emissions, positive numbers, and CO2 removals, negative, below the axis obviously. So you have scenario 2's reliance on greater CO2 removal for reaching the same outcome as scenario 1, but this poses increased risks. In the meantime, temperatures are supposed to go up and stay flat because you have hit the cumulative carbon target at that point. Different climate outcomes, different risks. You have to think about committed warming and climate sensitivity and so on to make sure that you understand this part about transient response and then equilibrium response, where you are fixing the temperature to stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees C. Different climate outcomes, different risks. Again, similarly, CO2 emissions and temperature. Delayed action scenario allows more net CO2 emissions than in CO2, so you are overshooting, and then CDR reliance is much higher, whereas here you are crashing and then staying at zero, let's say. So temperature overshoot and back, and no overshoot and you hit the target and stay there. Okay, so all these then come back to play into risks, impacts on people, and the legalities of those increased risks because you delayed your emissions reductions and relied more heavily on CDR. So CDR here is a proxy for what you didn't do in terms of emissions to allow overshoot and then come back, and what is the impact of those overshoots. Some text here. In addition to these 3D norms, the customary international law norm of harm prevention is engaged in relation to states' actions on climate change. So I've skipped some text, but you can go and read what this means. I just wanted to make this point. This norm requires a high standard of due diligence from states to prevent transboundary environmental harm. So your emissions are not staying within your boundary, and your lack of action is not affecting only you, it's going to affect everybody. Right? Among the factors influencing the standard of due diligence in relation to climate harms are the consequences of failing to exercise such due diligence. Given the catastrophic impacts of continuing climate change, due diligence requires states to take urgent, transformative action that has realistic, scientifically backed prospects of stabilizing global temperatures. This, of course, doesn't address all the other issues we talked about, where how can developing countries stay on track for climate action and their NDCs. Comes to transfer of technology, intellectual property rights, financial aid, and so on. Moving forward, then, the unquantified extent and geographical and technological makeup of states' CDR dependence limits global scrutiny of climate targets and should advance calls for enhanced disclosure in countries reporting of their emissions mitigation action domestically and to the UNFCCC, including through disaggregating targets for removals and net emissions reductions, so that you know what is actually emission reduction and what is drawdown. Plus there are other details here in terms of whether local mitigations add up to global mitigation at all. So that's a separate discussion. Even climate commitments that are conceivably consistent with some 1.5 degree C aligned emission reduction pathways may still be inconsistent with international law norms, because all but the most ambitious cuts in gross emissions create high CDR dependence. So here the focus is high CDR dependence, which means you have overshot or you have allowed overshoot to happen of the global warming targets. The estimated extent of states' dependence on CDR does not conform to international law norms and principles. Doing so would require far steeper near-term emissions cuts than are planned under most national policies. Our analysis also demonstrates the need for interdisciplinary scientific and legal research that clarifies the appropriateness of and risks associated with specific emission reduction pathways. Such research would provide basis for legal scrutiny, including by quantifying implied state and corporate CDR dependence. Moreover, legal analysis could identify a range of state CDR reliance that is consistent with interpretation of international and domestic laws given the associated risks. Improved disclosure coupled with further scientific and legal research will clarify how states need to accelerate emissions reductions. Otherwise, given the recent growth in climate-related legal action, states' CDR dependence may be the next aspect of climate action or inaction to be challenged in a court. Of course, when we mention corporations, you have to understand that many corporations work across boundaries in multiple states. Apple produces components somewhere, assembles them somewhere, resources come from somewhere and sold heavily in every country, and so on and so forth. So embedded carbon, transboundary carbon, and your mitigation within your boundaries, it gets very complicated if you want to then look at legal commitments, compliances, and not just legal implications but norms. What are you doing about taking care of your own citizens in terms of their health and well-being and food security, water security, and generally the sustainable development goals. So there has to be compatibility there as well. Okay, so let's leave this here. These points are important and interesting, and climate scientists don't generally think of these, so I wanted to include these here. Okay.